Hello friends, I'm back with you this week to talk about a different kind of a subject. Not legislation per se or even oversight, but about our encouraging our senators and representatives to speak out publicly, either on the floor of the Senate and the House, as they often do. In fact, every day you'll see them for 5 minutes or 1 minute or even in extended discussions, or even in op-ed pieces in the newspaper or other such venues. What I want you to ask your senators and representatives to do is to look at what is happening with respect to what has been called a new Cold War, where Russia, specifically President Putin, is invading his neighbor, the Republic of the Ukraine, in Crimea and in the eastern Ukraine, is sending tanks and other heavy equipment into Ukraine, all the while dissembling, really lying, and saying he's not doing that. At the same time, we mustn't forget Iran, where President Rouhani, although supposedly nicer, more moderate, more peace-loving than his predecessors, also has said terrible things, as have the Ayatollahs who hold the real power in Iran, about Israel, the Jewish people, and about America. And so we have these authoritarian figures which threaten their neighbors with hatred, terrorism, war, genocide, and are undeterred by sanctions or by the opprobrium of speeches in the United Nations. So I'm suggesting that if they want a Cold War, bring it on. We can handle that. The United States, under various presidents, and specifically President Reagan, and under various senators and representatives, specifically Senator Scoop Jackson and Congressman Vanek of Illinois, took measures to ensure that there were consequences for authoritarian figures, for dictators who threaten their neighbors, like the leaders of the Soviet Union. I just want to describe two principal measures, two principal initiatives that helped bring down the Soviet Union, the evil empire. These are, first, the Jackson-Vanek Amendment, in which Senator Jackson and Congressman Vanek came up with an amendment which basically stated that Russia would enjoy no most favored nation treatment in U.S. trade law, that is to say, no normal trade with the United States, and therefore no improvement in its economy until the Soviet Union abided by the recognized international norms with respect to how they treated their Jewish residents and the other citizens of the Soviet Union, and how they treated their neighbors, that is to say, whether they occupied other countries, like all of the countries of Central Europe, and threatened to attack and overcome and occupy the whole world. And how was this to be enforced, this Jackson-Vanek Amendment? The other part, the other side of the coin, was the Helsinki Treaty, and the process under that very unique and powerful treaty, which meant that there would be intrusive inspections, public and private, by various bodies, and complete, honest, and frank, tell-it-all reporting to the world about what the Soviet Union was doing and not doing with respect to its own citizens and its neighbors and world peace, etc. So these laid the groundwork for what happened when President Reagan came along and said, I am going full scale into anti-ballistic missile defenses. And of course the media instantly at that time termed it Star Wars, as in the movies that were popular then and to a great extent still are. But these three things brought down the Soviet Union. There were other things, I know. There were spiritual, political, and other things. The union of President Reagan with Maggie Thatcher, the Prime Minister of the UK, Pope John Paul, the Polish leaders, and more. Everybody played a role. Even some Soviet rulers were a little more enlightened and realized the time had come when they could no longer dominate all those nations and try to conquer the world. But let's look at the parallel today. We should have some senators and some representatives say, maybe not all three of these things in one package, but at least as their own personal interests and expertise apply, say that before Russia can continue to have normal trade relations with the U.S., we might have to bring up something very much like the Jackson-Vanik Amendment and the full-scale Helsinki Treaty process. And third, as I mentioned just now, we should have a new initiative from the Congress to say we are going to have as complete a protection against missiles, intercontinental ballistic missiles, be they from the Ayatollahs of Iran with nuclear warheads that they're developing or threatening to develop, or even those old nuclear powers like Russia or China. We are going to have an as close as we can to an ironclad anti-ballistic missile defense. And we can look, of course, to Israel, which has the Arrow anti-missile defenses and Iron Dome and various other missile defenses that they've developed in cooperation with us and with our assistance. But I think this is what we have to be helping our good senators and representatives on the Hill to do, and encouraging them to say in this very critical election year this fall, where many of them are either running for re-election or are retiring and someone may be replacing them. We need to have these issues raised in the election campaign because they affect not just the survival of Israel, or particularly the survival of Israel, but the protection of the national security of the United States, which is being sorely neglected and it is not being accomplished by this White House or this State Department. So we'll be saying more about this, but I want you, as you're meeting with your senators, as you're meeting with your representatives, to tell them it's time that perhaps they flag the issue that we might need the Jackson-Vanik Amendment or something like it to be raised again, the full Helsinki Treaty inspection and reporting process, and third, the fullest possible anti-ballistic missile defenses, including defenses against what's called the EMP threat, the electromagnetic pulse effect, in which one of these adversary powers that I've mentioned could explode a nuclear device from a missile over America and cripple perhaps 90% of our grid, of our cyber grid, which controls so many of our industries, our power grid, our communications, and more, which would be a tremendous threat to all of our population and could produce an incalculable number of deaths, injuries, and great human suffering for all our population. So this is a sweeping proposal that I'm making, but we will be bringing forth more details of this in the weeks ahead. But meanwhile, raise these issues, please, with your senators and representatives. Have them get in touch with us if they want more details. And meanwhile, thanks again for renewing your membership in CPAC or joining for the first time if you never have. And if you've been a good dues-paying member of CPAC at any level over the years, think about giving the most generous tax-free contribution you can to Merkel, the Middle East Research Center, our 501c3, to help us pay the wonderful, creative young Jewish and Christian assistants that we have here who are helping to make it all possible here in Washington, representing you on these key issues that no one else talks about, but which are most important to our security and that of Israel. Thanks very much. God bless you, and we'll talk again next week.